Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 61 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And with me is my fellow traveller on the existential highway of counselling and psychotherapy, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you, Ken?
I am good. It is a little crisper in the air at the moment, I guess. Blue skies, yet chilly from where I'm recording from today. But a great episode to warm you up if you're experiencing a cold day where you are. And we're starting off episode 61 by looking at the difference between an ethical dilemma and an ethical conflict. And I know that you're going to enjoy that area, Rory, because you enjoy the ethics and ethical problem-solving matrices. And we may even give you some nice reference links of some materials we already have on our website for that one. Going into theory with Rory today, which is from transactional analysis. And we're going to be looking at rackets and stamps. Rory, can you give us just a taster of what we can expect?
Indeed, Ken. I'll give you an aperitif of what you can expect. And it's taken really from a lecture that's in the CSR, the Counselling Study Resource, our academic library, on transactional analysis, a lecture that I recently delivered. And it's called The Theory of Rackets and Stamps, basically. And it links really to how, as children, we may manage our feelings. And if we repress them, what happens possibly in later life.
Like it. Looking forward to that one. And I like the aperitif that you gave Rory. And then we're going to be closing episode 61 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, looking at the id, ego and superego. And we have a question that came in on Facebook, and we're going to be trying to explain id, ego and superego in words that we can all understand, because I think that was the question. But, you know, speaking about our Facebook group, this is how we kind of plan, and it's our Facebook group that informs what we bring on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And our first topic today of that difference between ethical dilemma and ethical conflict actually came in from our Facebook group. So if you want to take part in our Facebook group, just go to Facebook, put in Counselling Tutor, knock on the door, we will let you in. Come and join well over 10,000. I think we hit 10,000 a good 6 months ago, fellow students, tutors, people interested in counselling from all around the world, and come and join that discussion. What question did we get, Rory?
Well, it was from Shelley Shaw. So hi, Shelley. And she posted in our Facebook group. And she's a new member as well. So, you know, new member, fantastic. Posted a fantastic question. Needing a bit of guidance, please. Currently on level 4 diploma, doing an assignment on ethics. What is the difference between an ethical dilemma and an ethical conflict? All pointers welcome. Thank you.
Dun, dun, dun. Good question.
It is a good question, and ethics are always tricky for people to kind of sometimes understand. Well, the difference between a dilemma and a conflict is where two things bump into each other and you know it. So an ethical conflict would be, say, for instance, if I decided to counsel Ken. That would be a conflict because Ken is my business partner, and in the ethical framework it talks about dual relationships. Not that Ken perhaps would want to be counselled by me, but just to give you an example, that's a conflict. Also, another conflict would be deciding, you know, that you wanted to counsel your partner, your life partner. That's an ethical conflict because it says quite clearly that you shouldn't have any other relationship other than a professional relationship with your client. That's a conflict. So those are two real conflicts. Dual relationships are, I would imagine, the biggest one. But an ethical dilemma is where you're left with a situation where you need to take some action. Mm-hmm. And it's not really that clear cut. And what you have to do is you have to use an ethical problem solving grid. And we have one, which we can download. We'll put a link in the show notes. And what you have to do is you have to go through a theory of steps to evidence your defensible decision making. And take a chance. And there are in some cases, when I used to teach, I'd say this on a regular basis. If you have an ethical dilemma and you act on it to try and resolve it ethically, it may be that the outcome could be either okay or not okay. But a dilemma may be I'll give you an example of a dilemma. A client presents at counselling. They've driven to the therapy room, and quite clearly they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs. And the dilemma may be, well, does the therapist call the police?
Yeah, good example. Really is. And that problem-solving matrix that you referred to there, we have another podcast where we spoke about that, which we'll kind of put the link in for as well. So well worth going and looking at that show notes page. And you'll get that just going to counsellingtutor.com, clicking on the podcast tab, go to episode 61. Show notes are there, and those links and that problem-solving matrix will be downloadable from the page. Talking of the conflict, sometimes a conflict can come based on the agency that you might be working on, and they may have information in their operating procedures that are in conflict with what we might have in the BACP ethical framework, where it differs slightly. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a massive smash, but in the BACP ethical framework, we're given clear boundaries of when we break confidentiality. But we may be working in an agency where they require us to break confidentiality under different circumstances. For instance, if you're working in drugs and alcohol for an agency and delivering counselling within that service, you may be required to break confidentiality if one of your clients discusses with you and mentions that they've been taking drugs, which is in conflict, I guess, to the BACP ethical framework, which doesn't require that. But it is, again, I guess that conflict is clearly contracted and boundaried in that first session when you kind of outline with your client what is on offer. So it's about looking at it and seeing how you feel with it. And there may be some areas where you feel that you cannot work because of the conflicts that may be there. But the ethical dilemma, that's the heavy one. That's when you find yourself going, what do I do now? And you can pick up the phone, you can phone the BACP, they've got an ethics department, they are there, you can have a chat with them, but at the end of the day, it's about you and how you work through that dilemma and how you evidence that you've worked through it, and you evidence the decisions you make, defendable decision making, showing how and why you made those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of ethical conflicts can, as Ken said, can be smoothed over or rectified just by altering the contract. So, a conflict would be in, as Ken said, confidentiality. There are certain things you've got to break confidentiality for, but the agency may have specific things, in which case you just put that into a contract. The client understands that, it's transparent, the client it gives consent, and as a consequence, that conflict disappears. But ethical dilemmas are a bit more nuanced because it means you having to make and I'm going to use this word, we never use this in counselling, do we, Ken? A judgment call.
Oh, I like that.
You have to make a judgment. You have to make a judgment. So if you do get someone who's sat in front of you who's under the influence, the outcome of you reporting them to the police may be that you break their confidentiality. But then what you have to balance is the greater good and the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. How would you justify it if your client ran over someone, killed them, and then that's where they'd been and had been for counselling, and I was drunk in counselling, I was under the influence in counselling, but the counsellor didn't say anything. So that is a dilemma, and you need to be able to, if you decide what to do in that case, you need to evidence defensible decision making, and that's done with an ethical problem-solving grid. So you can say, look, this is what I did. These are the things I considered, and this is the conclusion I came to.
And it's tricky, and I guess that's the question itself is a good question because it is tricky. And in that instance that you bring, Rory, I guess if we spot that, we see it, we smell the alcohol on the client's breath, and we do nothing because we go, well, it's that client's choice to get in their car and drive that way, and they're in an accident where somebody is very badly hurt or even worse may lose their life. Where do you stand morally and ethically as the counsellor? And defensible decision making is making that decision, and the ethical, the problem solving matrix calls upon you to look into the future. What can be the consequences of this, of action, of inaction within this? So it's a really good and informed piece of work by Professor Tim Bond, I do believe, Rory, the ethical problem solving matrix.
It is. There's quite a few. There's quite a few ethical problem-solving matrix out there on the internet. But the one by Tim Bond, it's also available on the BACP website as a free download. But really, really useful and essential if you're ever having to justify your decisions. Remember, even as a student, it's professional work. And as a consequence of that, you have to adapt and adopt professional standards.
I like it. And just in ending, just a conflict to throw out. And this is kind of taken from real life and adjusted for our podcast here by anonymizing it in some way. If you were asked as a counsellor working within an agency to counsel within a room, and when you went inside that room, you could clearly hear that it was not a confidentially sealed room, that you could hear people speaking outside, and that indeed people outside that room could hear you speaking in that room, would you counsel a client within that room giving confidential information? Now, there is a conflict, because it is in conflict with the BACP ethical framework says that the counselling is a confidential relationship. And if your agency is saying, no, but you need to be in that room, you've got a conflict in your hands. And that's when we have to look to ourselves and go, what am I deciding here? Because this is ultimately my practice, and there is a conflict, an ethical conflict here.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth remembering that even as a student, you have the power to call it out. You can say, no, this is wrong. If you've been taught something and you know clearly and you've taken advice, you can call it out. I remember a good few years ago, some of my students came to me with a contract from an agency, and they said, we're not really happy with this contract. And I said, well, what are you going to do about it? And they kind of stared at me. And I said, well, it's your placement. What are you going to do? And they went, well, we think we should go and tell them. I said, well, see how they go. And what was really interesting is, from their perspective, their frame of reference, they thought they'd be thrown out of their practice and their placement had kind of disbarred them. What happened was the placement was super happy that people who were on the cutting edge of their learning were feeding in to their activities, and they altered their contract. Super proud of those learners.
100%. I remember when we were lecturing together, Rory, a similar incident where the learner went and challenged the procedures within an agency, and they also were changed. And it just shows that an ethical conflict can result in the betterment of a service. And it's about us having the courage, which we're called upon in the BACP ethical framework, to have that courage, the candor, to say it as it is and to say it as we see it, as opposed to just keep it inside and go, oh, well, what can I do? I have to listen to the placement manager. Really good topic. I like it. And great debate. So moving away from ethical conflicts and ethical dilemmas, Rory, onto something, I guess, a little less dilemma-y, and that is theory with Rory, looking at transactional analysis and looking at rackets and stamps.
Yes, it's not, as you might imagine it, a shopping trip down to your local superstore. It is actually a piece of TA theory, which informs us about how, as children, if we don't engage with our authentic feelings, we may bottle them up, or we may use that kind of bottled up anger and use it like you get stamps on a coffee loyalty card. And once your coffee loyalty card's full, you cash it in for a good old-fashioned rant and argument. So it's a neat little piece of theory. It's a very short piece of theory, but if anybody's studying TA, very useful.
Let's go straight into theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
We've all come across people from time to time who all of a sudden blow up. They become angry, sometimes for no apparent reason, or maybe over the trivialest of things. Sometimes for the people on the receiving end of the anger, it can be quite confusing or even a little scary. There is a theory within transactional analysis that may explain this phenomenon, and it's sometimes called a racket feeling. A racket feeling is where a child replaces an authentic feeling with one that's socially acceptable to his or her parents. The child grows up to believe that it's never okay to show feelings of anger, fear, sadness or happiness. This becomes part of the child's life script. This behaviour becomes so familiar that they do not feel authentic emotion anymore. A variation of this idea is called stamp collecting, and it plays out like this. People who hide or restrict their real emotions tend to keep them as bad memories, rather like collecting stamps on a coffee shop loyalty card. When they have collected sufficient stamps, they can, like with a loyalty card, trade them in for self-permission to justify having an angry outburst, even if the current situation doesn't really warrant it. Some people collect stamps on an emotional loyalty card for a day. Some store them up for years before cashing them in. The way to stop this cycle is to try and work through bad memories, perhaps in therapy, with the aim of letting them go. It's also useful to rewrite the script into one which allows you to speak authentically about your feelings as they arrive, instead of repressing them by adding them to your stamp collection.
Do enjoy a bit of TA, Rory. Every now and again you throw it in, and really good stuff there. And of course, if you want to get hold of Rory's super duper handout, 2 ways you can do that. Number one, you can go to our website, that's counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode 61, all of the downloads, links and handouts from today's podcast you will find there. Alternatively, if you are a Handouts Vault member, or you are a member of the Counselling Study Resource, which of course incorporates the Handouts Vault, then just log into your Counselling Study Resources portal with your username and your password, and the handout has already been added to the Handouts Vault. And if you're listening to this and thinking, what is the Counselling Study Resource and how do I log in? Well, all that information you will find at the end of today's program, where we give you the link of how to go there as well. But thank you for that, Rory. And then moving on, and we're going to be looking again at a question that came in regarding id, ego, super ego. Can be confusing, and we've been asked to clarify this. Can you share the post that came in?
I can, and again, it's from our Facebook group. It's David Kine. So, hi, David. And he says, can someone give me an example of the id, the ego, and the superego in words I can understand? Thank you. Well, the answer is yes, I can. I'll let him a little secret. I've already answered this. But I've got to share it on the podcast because I had a hilarious interchange with my fellow teaching colleague who works in Merseyside. It's Lenny Sarther, a contributor to the Facebook page, fellow tutor, and she teaches it using a cake, chocolate cake, Ken.
Oh, yummy. Yes, delicious. Let's have a slice, Rory. Come on. All
right, okay. We've had the T in the A.
We did.
To go with it. Okay, so basically, let's have some background. Id, ego, and superego are the work of Sigmund Freud, the father, really, of counselling or talking therapies. And, of course, his ideas were something called drive theory. In other words, he believed that our psyche was driven by biological drives. And he came up with this idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. Well, for those of you who have studied TA, it's basically a kind of idea of child, adult, and parent. The id is the child, the ego is the adult, and the superego is the parent. Slightly different in TA though, because in psychoanalysis, because the superego is really representative of societal values. So this is what Lenny Sarther teaches, and it's absolutely fantastic. If you're a teacher out there, I guarantee you'll be using this in your class. Okay, basically you have a chocolate cake. Yeah, you're sitting in front of a big chocolate cake, and part of you goes, I want to eat all that cake, and I want to eat it now. Okay, that's the id. Yeah, that's the id. But I'm going to eat all that cake. I have to say, this is not autobiographical of me, Ken, much. So this is big cake. I want to eat all this cake. And then this voice says, well, Rory, if you eat all that cake, it's not going to do your blood pressure any good. And also you're going to put on weight. And also you might get diabetes. And you should be eating fruit. There's your superego, yeah? And look at all that research about what happens if you eat cake and people dying early and, you're a burden on the NHS. That's the superego. The ego is a little bit in the middle. It goes, okay, Id, I know you want to eat all the cake, but I think superego is right. I think they're right because, you don't want to eat all of it. You're going to be ill, maybe unwell. But hey, superego, you're going to have a bit of enjoyment in life. So I'm just going to have a slice.
Oh.
And the whole thing about I just love this. The whole thing about the ego, it spends its time sort of saying to the superego, all right, I hear that we should be doing this, but maybe if we could do this. And also then looking to the id, which is the kind of uncontrolled child, and saying, okay, I know you want to do all this, but maybe we just have to limit ourselves a little bit. Maybe we have to be a bit adult. And that basically is how you explain the ego state. It's good for level 2 and a little bit for level 3, I think.
I really like that, and I can definitely see how it goes into the PAC model of transactional analysis. And if you study that and kind of listen back to what Rory said now, it makes a lot of sense. And as you were describing it, I could certainly see that little child, I want to eat all the cake, hey! And we're saying that's the id, the free thinking, consequences are not a concern of mine. I just want to do it without thinking. Very impulsive kind of behavior. And then when you were describing the super ego, Rory, I almost saw this very serious, stern judge with a big grey wig on and a big bony finger waggling and going, no, you don't want to be eating all of it. It's almost like our critical thinking part of our brain telling us, no, you can't do that. And it's interesting how they're very much in conflict with one another, those two ego states. And then in the middle, there is your balance. That is where you find that balance. And it may sometimes kind of lean more towards the free-thinking child, or it may even at other times lean a little more towards the stern finger-waving judge. It kind of it incorporates both of those, and in the here and now, in kind of, I guess, what we might call the adult ego state, makes a decision of how we proceed.
Absolutely, and that basically is ego. The other thing to remember is a lot of this process, according to Freud, was largely subconscious. Well, certainly the id was subconscious, and part of the ego was subconscious, below the conscious waterline. So sometimes we act in behaviours that we don't know we're doing. It's only when someone points it out and says, "Do you really need to eat that really big cake? Is that?" Sounds like our house on a regular basis, Ken. I have my own superego that lives with me, and I'm very grateful of that. Sometimes it really is a case of just not knowing until someone points it out and goes, that's not a portion, is it? That's like 5 portions. You sure you don't want to eat that? Or even better, eat a banana.
Love it. What a great example of id, ego, and superego with that chocolate cake. We kicked off episode 61 by looking at the ethical dilemma versus ethical conflict. Theory with Rory, sticking with that T, Rory, the TA. We looked at rackets and stamps, and of course we've just ended with looking at that id, ego, and superego. Great episode. Looking forward to next week. What can I say?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and just don't eat too much cake.
If you enjoy the topics and handouts here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, then you will love the Counselling Study Resource. CSR was built by myself, Ken, and Rory Lees-Oakes to give you the support you need during your counselling studies. So get access to the world's most comprehensive collection of resources aimed at supporting you in your journey to become a counsellor. Take the stress out of your studies by visiting counsellingtutor.com/CSR. That's counsellingtutor.com/CSR.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.